Namaste.
Namaste.
So we're celebrating, I guess, All Saints Day, which is traditionally November 1st, and All Souls Day, which was the bone thrown to the rest of us, on November 2nd, which was all part of this thing that really begins on Halloween, which I don't recall offhand when, or more or less around medieval times. There was All Saints Day was November 1st, and there was this tradition where in the thoughts, it goes back to actually to Jewish times, where tomorrow began when the sun went down tonight, if that makes any sense. So we didn't go from one day to the next at midnight, we went from one day to the next when the sun went down. And so you have these traditions in the church that sprung up, like, Christmas Eve Mass. At Easter, the first service of Easter was always Saturday night after the sun went down, the Great Vigil. And so there became this celebration that was called All Hallows Eve, because All Saints Day was known as All Hallows, hallowed going to halo, going to holy, going to... And so Halloween, the reason the Halloween name comes out of this All Hallows Eve thing getting jumbled and turned around over the years. And yes, it's true, there's also a pagan celebration, and it was kind of interesting on Facebook this week. I saw all this stuff, everybody's sort of trying to claim Halloween. And it's not really, All Hallows Eve wasn't really a Christian thing. It goes back to pagan times and the celebration of the harvest and things. And well, yes, it does, but there's still all these Christian traditions that come out of pagan traditions, because when you're trying to compete with when you've got the new car dealership in town and you want to compete with the car dealership that's already in town, you have the same hours and you're open at the same time and you follow the same celebrations. And so it really belongs to both. And traditionally, of course, back in the old days, and today too, for those who believe in hell, All Saints Day was this celebration of sort of the people that got into the Hall of Fame in terms of Christianity, the really notable folks who usually were professional religious, but not always, but most often. And then they said, well, what about everybody else? And that's where they came up with the idea that we ought to have All Souls Day too. And for those of us today who don't really believe in hell, All Saints Day and All Souls Day really covers everybody. And in fact, everybody could be part of All Saints Day. But I think it's nice to look at both. And I see it played out, we're in November, so Thanksgiving's going to come, Christmas is going to come, all those lovely family holidays. And I've always conceived of the difference between All Saints Day and All Souls Day as the difference between my two sets of grandparents. And I've told you a little bit about my Grandpa Schrader, who liked to play cut the heads off of chickens, and told me, he'd been hit in the back of the head with a hatchet, and that's why that crease was there. Grandpa Schrader was 5'4". And Nana Schrader was 4'11".
Wow.
On a good day, if she stretched. And so there were these diminutive little people. On the other hand, Nana and Grandpa Bergland was 6 feet tall, and it's hard even to call her Nana. Grandma Bergland was 5'8", and could have started at linebacker for the Green Bay Packers. And she actually played basketball, I guess, in college, and was quite fierce. She would have been like the Shaquille O'Neal, probably, of her day, in terms of how she must have, at 5'8" and broad-shouldered, dominant, stood over all the other people who were playing college basketball in the 20s, right? So she would come in, and she always walked on high heels, and she was wobbly. She was not good on heels. And so she'd come in with these heels, and you'd be moving to position of safety. And over the fireplace and over the mantle, we had this huge mirror in our house. One of those things that's supposed to make the room look bigger, So it was probably about 6 feet wide and maybe 4 feet tall. And she'd walk over to this mirror to check her look, as she's like, right? And she'd look at the mirror, and we'd be sitting maybe in the dining room, so we'd get the side view. and she'd start smoothing out her slip, and then she'd make sure that everything was smooth up here, and she's very large busted. And her dentures were loose, so she always did this. She'd be like, come over here and give your grandma a kiss. And it'd be like, and she talked like that too, because her family was from Missouri, and it'd be like, can you wash your hands first? You know? And there was, and so it was like there were these really cute, tiny, lovable people, and then there was this freight train that liked to stroke herself. And in public. And would always, you know, she said she had a hiatal hernia, so it never failed. The meal would start, and she'd have to go running out and say she just spit up in the bathroom, which was really appetite enhancing. But that's kind of the difference to me between All Souls and All Saints, is that there's people we can look at and say, yeah, you know, they're really, I value what they do, and it's not that they're perfect, but finding the silver lining in them is really easy, because it shines through them. And then there's other people you have to dig a little harder. And yet, maybe that's the goal of life. Maybe that's the spiritual road. How do I find, not so much in the easy people, but in the people where it's a little bit more of a struggle, how do I find their good qualities? The God within. Yeah, how do I find that shining through? And with these readings, that first reading from Wisdom is from what Protestants call the Apocrypha. And so what happens is you have the Hebrew Bible, and everything in the Hebrew Bible is pretty much written by 400, what's now called BCE, before the Common Era, what we used to call BC. And then, but it's in Hebrew. And the language of the Middle East, the business language at the time, was Greek. And there were some other texts that had been written in Greek that were used in worship in the synagogue at the time. And but obviously came later, were mostly written between, say, 400 and, you know, depending on who you talk to, 100, well, around the time of Christ, more or less. And at one point they decide, we really need to get this Bible that we're using in the synagogue into the language that people understand, especially as Judaism now is moving through the Mediterranean. And so they write what's called they translate what's called the Septuagint, which the root of that is a Greek word that stands for, now I'm having a brain fart, it's either 70 or 72, because supposedly that's how many people they sent off and said, translate this into Greek. And so they translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and they said, you know, we got these other books that explain what's going on in the Jewish world too, and we'll just bind them all together in the Septuagint. And eventually, you get that to be the dominant, I'd say Jewish Bible, because it's really, I don't want to insult anybody Jewish, but it's the Jewish scripture book. And Hebrew starts to become more and more a language that isn't used. Now, you fast forward to the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther and his neuroses and a few other folks say, wait a minute, those books really weren't part of the original Bible. They were part of the Bible that the Roman Catholic Church, well, the only church in town, used for 1,500 years, but the Protestants hacked them off. Never mind that those books are quoted from quite a bit in the New Testament, that St. Paul was obviously very conversant with those books and quotes out of them directly. You know, it's that, again, you're opening a new car dealership, so you want to do some of the things the way the other car dealership does it, and you want to do some things differently. So they hack these things off. And I think that's too bad. There's really some great stuff in there. The Book of Wisdom is one of them, and this passage is an optional passage for funerals in the Episcopal Church. And you can see why. It's really hard to use it with somebody who died in a fire, maybe, and there have been times that I've decided not to use it, you know. But this idea, pre-Christ now, that within Jewish culture there is a life after death, you know, which is part of that evolving consciousness, because at first it was God likes good people, God hates bad people. But everybody dies. If you're good and you die, you go to what was called Upper Sheol.
What?
Upper, as in upper and lower, Upper Sheol, S-H-E-O-L. It was a place of the dead. It was kind of like limbo. You're just kind of not dancing under the pole, but you're just kind of hanging out, not heaven and hell kind of thing.
Purgatory?
Except there was no exit. This is just where you went.
Oh.
And then if you were really bad, you went to Lower Sheol. It's kind of like the bargain basement at department store in Chicago. You know, it's like going to Marshall Fields into the basement levels. Where the lower you go, the scarier it is. And the more fabulous it is, but that's another story. And there, body and soul is dead. Upper Sheol, just your body had died, and you're sort of warehoused in this soul place. So this was the traditional Jewish view, and where you went was determined by whether God liked you or not, and you could tell whether God liked you or not because you had a lot of stuff if God liked you, and you didn't if God didn't. And then all of a sudden, about 600 years before Jesus, Israel gets conquered, and even the good people get conquered. In fact, the good people get taken away. The not so good people who were poor, and this is how, they weren't really good, the wealthy, powerful people get taken away. The less powerful, less wealthy people get left in Jerusalem. God lives in Jerusalem. Holy cow, how would God let the people God loved get taken away? And the people God didn't like get left, living in the neighborhood with God. And so they came up with this idea and said, oh, of course, that reward is after you die. And that's where this starts, right? So don't worry now. It may be really crappy now, but after you die, it'll be okay. Which, is great consolation if you're not very bright. And so,
Sounds suicide driven.
yeah, well, it can encourage that.
But it's gonna be better.
It's an exit, right?
It's just-
But that's also how you get people to go off and fight in war, because you'll be martyred, and that's a straight ticket to heaven. So, this reading from this book of wisdom starts to see that they're starting to think, even before Christ, that there's maybe some kind of resurrection. In fact, that's the distinction between Pharisees and Sadducees in Jesus' time. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection and a life after death, and the Sadducees didn't, which is why they were sad, you see. See, but you'll not forget now. So there's this idea that something happens after, that it's not just good or bad, that it's not just you get what you get and that's the end of it, that there's some other values that pervade, and of course the value that persists is this idea of love. And love not meaning somebody I can have a nice relationship with, although you can have a nice relationship, but somebody who I really care about. This love being the thing that allows me, at least at times, to be a little more concerned about what somebody else wants or needs than I am about myself. And to do that, we start hearing Jesus talking about stuff that sounds really upside down. Those who love their lives will lose them, and those who hate their lives in this world will keep them forever. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you go back to this idea that if you did well in life, if you had a lot of stuff, it meant that God loved you, that's about appearances, right? If I have a lot of stuff, I may still go home and kick my wife and beat the dog, or is it the other way around? I may still be an absolutely lousy parent. I may still be wrestling my son in his pajamas in the entrance way to the Pick and Save in Hales Corners this morning, which was another story. I could appear to be okay. Under that old system, you'd think I was okay, because I had stuff, I had my Lexus, right? But as it plays out, I could be the biggest jerk in the history of the world, right? Or I might not have the proverbial pot to piss in. But I could be the nicest, kindest, most caring kind of person, would give you the shirt off his back, hopefully with another one underneath it if it was me. And so they started to understand there was a difference between what seemed to be the appearance of somebody and their actual true self and character. And what, in contemporary spiritual terms, we talk about that as being ego. being what seems to be, the tribute to myself, the thing I set up to make me look okay, the fact that I rake my leaves, not really because I want to rake my leaves, because the neighbors did. And what will everybody say if I don't rake mine? Now my theory is the wind will come, blow them into my neighbor's freshly raked yard, and I won't have to work.
That's reality.
So, but it was that there was this something underneath is the real me. And this ego, or this facade, or this mask that I put on, this role that I play, this persona, whatever it is. The things I do out in public to make people think well of me are ultimately the things that create a barrier between me and the spiritual life. Or if you will, between me and God. So when Jesus talks about if you love your life, and then it sort of gets clarified later in this world, if you love that ego business, well, when you die, that ego business goes away, right? You can't take it with you. He who dies with the most toys may win, but he's also going to be pretty upset on the other side because he's not going to get to take his toys with him. And so that can't be how it works. That there's this face we present and the real us. And if you love the face you present, well, you're going to be left with nothing because you've never developed, or in my particular belief, you're going to come back and try it again. But in the traditional heaven and hell belief, this face isn't what gets you to heaven. And the goal, of course, is to get the real you underneath all that to match the you that you show to the outside world. So that there is no separation or distinction. So that you don't have to stop in the mirror to make sure that everything's smooth. Because that's ego. And God knows my grandmother's not the only person in the world that ever does this. This idea that I'm acceptable only if I don't have any wrinkles, or if I'm wearing the right clothes, or what every teenager goes through. Do I have the right clothes on? Because I refuse to be defined by my clothes,
Yeah.
and in doing so, become defined by my clothes. But that's another story. Is it okay just to be who I am? How many churches and other venues have we seen where you need to be wearing the right stuff to be in and be okay? And what does that mean if the right stuff is beyond what you can afford? What does it say if we have a church or a synagogue or a mosque, and if you don't have a $1,500 suit on, you're looked down upon? Well, it's saying that we're moving into that pretend stuff, that facade, and away, an ego, and away from the things that really matter, which of course is love, our heart, our caring for other people. And it also sets up, if you really think about it, you're either dressed right or you're not, this sort of black and white mentality. On, off, hot, cold, good, bad, acceptable, not. And there's no in between. There's no sense that life is a journey. Life is instead a race, and you either win or you don't. But what in our life really works like that? Who goes to a job on the first day fully competent? Unless you really are underemployed, you don't. Who meets somebody and all of a sudden 5 seconds later has a fully developed relationship with years of history in it? Well, nobody, right? Who picks up any new hobby or skill and is immediately proficient at it? Well, nobody. There's a learning curve to life. And it only makes sense then that we have to look at spirituality in the same way. And we have to look at our spiritual development in the same way. So yeah, sometimes to get things done, we take the shortcut. Sometimes there's a situation where we do have to play a role. But it's what's going on underneath that matters. And I'm going to say that what's going on underneath, much like any of those other things I mentioned, is an ongoing process of evolution. That we can get wrapped up in, well, after I die, will they celebrate me on All Saints' Day or will they celebrate me on All Souls' Day? When really, the difference between All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day is in that superficial sort of facade. You were in the right place at the right time, so they rewrote your autobiography, you know, so that you cracked rainbows and peed glitter. Nobody does that. Well, you do. I think it would be painful, but that's just me. What do I know? And so maybe we can relax a little bit. Maybe for all of us, it's about we're on the road. And failure, I don't want to say isn't an option, because that sounds like it could happen, but we can't let it happen. Failure isn't even possible. It's just a constant process of learning. And as we learn, we move along the path a little more. And nobody gets 100% on every test. Right? And so there's going to be times when we seem to take a step back, but that's part of learning too. And I'd like to see us get to the place where we recognize that we are all perfectly fine, and in fact perfect, just the way we are, and, paradox for you, we're getting better all the time. And that is just the way it's meant to be. So we can relax. We can not worry. We can take the stress away. And in doing that, we start to see more clearly and understand what really matters to us. And know that what really matters to us is in the end what really matters to God as well. All right.
Amen.